Nothing like a good booze cruise. Just you, your friends, and a boat full of alcohol. And, hopefully, a sober crew. Very important the crew stays sober enough to make sure the party keeps going and you get where you're supposed to be. Unlike on the White Ship, when everyone joined in on the fun and the ship tore itself apart on a rocky outcropping moments after leaving harbor. So, what happened? I'm Andrew, and this is History's a Disaster. Tonight, we're diving into the icy waters of Barfleur for a shipwreck that plunged 12th century England into a 15-year bloody civil war. And tonight's episode is brought to you by On the Rocks Wine. They said you can't put ice in wine. They said it was, quote-unquote, against the rules of civilized society. Well, we said, who made you the boss of us? Introducing On the Rocks Wine, the only bottle of red that comes with its own tiny disclaimer card your sommelier friend will read out loud, get upset about it, and then leave the party. And good riddance to him. Available in 3 bold varieties: Cabernet Slushy, Chardonnay No You Didn't, and our reserve label, I don't care, it's hot outside. On the Rocks Wine, because life's too short to swirl. Way back in 1066, William the Conqueror, the current Duke of Normandy, crossed the Channel and invaded England. After winning the battle at Hastings, he pronounced himself king and had himself crowned in Westminster Abbey before the year was out. By the time he died in 1087, he ruled an empire that spanned the sea. England on one shore, Normandy on the other. It was held together for 2 decades, mostly by the force of his own will. And, as it turned out, force of will doesn't really transfer well after death. William split his empire the way medieval fathers often did, very badly. His eldest son, Robert Curthouse, got Normandy and the title of Duke. His second son, William Rufus, got England and became King William II. His youngest son, Henry, well, he got shit on. Just a few chests of silver and the vague promise that things might work out for him eventually. No land, no title, no army. Just some cash and good luck, son. Robert and William Rufus spent the better part of the next decade at war with each other over territory. You know, the way brothers with inherited kingdoms tend to do. Henry, who was landless and pretty much irrelevant to both of them, stayed out of it. He wanted nothing to do with that shit. At one low point, he even took a job working for the King of France, which was the family's traditional rival, which, ought to tell you, roughly how far down the ladder he'd fallen. Then in August 1100, everything changed in the span of an afternoon. Robert was off fighting in the First Crusade, and William Rufus organized a hunting party in the New Forest, and Henry, for once actually included in something, came along. During the hunt, an arrow meant for a stag instead found the king's chest. William Rufus was dead before anyone could do much about it. The man who fired the shot, a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, suspiciously fled the country and was never seriously prosecuted, which kind of makes you wonder how accidental the accident really was. And old Henry was conveniently nowhere to be seen. He was apparently off dealing with a broken bowstring and was being helped by local peasants. Once he heard about his brother's death, he didn't stick around. He made straight for Winchester, seized the royal treasury over some resistance from the nobles present, and made his claim to the throne stick the way such claims usually got made to stick in 1100, at the point of his sword. 3 days later, he was in London and crowned at Westminster Abbey, the same church where his father had been crowned 34 years earlier. Robert, still off in the Holy Land fighting the Crusades, was pissed when he got the news and invaded England to press his own claim. He lost. Henry not only kept his throne, but took Normandy from his brother in the process, reuniting their father's empire under a king who, a decade earlier, had owned nothing but a few chests of silver. So things were definitely looking up for Henry. Henry, as it would turn out, would be a genuine and capable king, much better than his shithead brother. He cracked down on the corruption and disorder that had crept in during his brother's reign, built out England's early administrative and legal machinery, and earned the nickname the Lion of Justice for how seriously he took the enforcement of law. Under Henry, thieves lost hands, counterfeiters lost more than that. It was brutal by today's standards, but it was consistent, and consistency was in short supply in the 12th century. His personal life, though, was a little less orderly than his kingdom. His wife, Queen Matilda of Scotland, bore him 2 legitimate children, a son William and a daughter, also named Matilda, because apparently every noblewoman in England in this period was named Matilda, since there's a lot of them in this story. Beyond his legitimate children, Henry liked to spread his seed around. He fathered somewhere between 20 and 25 illegitimate children with a rotating cast of mistresses. The exact number depends on, well, where you get your research from. But anyways, it was a hell of a lot. And he didn't hide them. He completely acknowledged them, married them into noble families, and placed them in positions of real power throughout England and Normandy. He was building up quite a dynasty through his illegitimate children placed throughout power. But the real dynasty, the one that mattered, ran through William Adelin, his only legitimate son, born in 1103. William was groomed from childhood to inherit everything, educated, married off strategically to Matilda of Anjou, see, another Matilda, to settle a border dispute on Normandy's southern flank, and was eventually given the title Duke of Normandy while his father was still alive. Handing Normandy to William served a second purpose too. It let Henry avoid formally paying homage to the King of France for the duchy, since his son could do it as a semi-independent duke instead. Everything was arranged, and everything was secure. Then November 1120 came. Henry had spent the autumn in Normandy, wrapping up business with the French crown and securing formal recognition of William's position as duke. Now, the royal party was ready to sail home. 2 ships waited to carry them across the channel. Henry took the first, a solid, unglamorous vessel made in the traditional longboat style, and set off without much ceremony. The second ship was offered to William. It was called the White Ship, either painted white or it was built from pale, unstained timber, depending on where you read. But either way, conspicuously, elegantly white against the gray Norman coast. Its captain, Thomas Fitzstephen, came from a family with its own claim on royal loyalty. His father had piloted the ship that carried William the Conqueror across the channel in 1066. Putting the king's heir on Fitzstephen's vessel was meant as an honor. And on that night, more than 200 people boarded with William. Young nobles, courtiers, members of the extended royal household, and 2 of Henry's illegitimate children, Richard and Matilda. It was in effect a cross-section of the next generation of English power, all gathered on a single deck. And they were in a mood to party. The only cargo below decks was wine. Lots and lots of wine. Dressed in silk and heavy furs, the young nobility of Anglo-Norman England settled in for what was supposed to be a pleasant crossing and instead became a hell of a party. Hell, the 50-man crew even joined in. At some point, the celebration got loud and confident enough that Stephen of Blois, William's cousin, and a grandson of the Conqueror, decided he'd had enough and complained of his stomach was hurting, and left before the ship left harbor. It was the most consequential stomachache in English history, as we'll come to find out. At the time, custom required a priest to bless the ship before it sailed. But when the priest arrived to perform the ritual for the white ship, the passengers, who were drunk as fuck, sent them away. There was no time for none of that shit. There was wine to drink, fun to be had, and a ship to be sailed. So by the time they were ready to actually leave, hours had passed. Henry's ship, along with every other vessel with a sober captain, had already sailed. Fitzstephen, drunk and overconfident, boasted to the passengers that his ship was fast enough to catch the king before he reached England, that they'd surely beat him home despite the head start. And of course, the drunken passengers cheered him on. So near midnight, the white ship finally sails off. The 50 oarsmen, hurried and drunk, hoisted the mainsail before they'd properly cleared the harbor, a decision that would have been reckless sober and damn near suicidal drunk. The wind caught the sail immediately, and the ship rushes forward, still inside the harbor's rocky approach. It struck the Quillbooth rocks almost at once. The rocks tear a hole into the hull below the waterline. Icy water flooded the lower decks, and within minutes, the ship rolled onto its side and went under. Young William, the future heir of England, made it into a small lifeboat and was rowed clear of the wreck, toward the shore and presumably toward the rest of his life as King of England. Then fate stepped in. He heard his half-sister Matilda screaming in the water. He could not leave her behind. He ordered the boat turned around. As soon as the lifeboat came close enough, panicked survivors swarmed it, clawing for a handheld on the only piece of safety left in the water. The boat sunk under the weight of them, and William went under with everyone else. The nobles, all dressed in the heavy furs they'd worn to the party, were dragged down by the weight of their own clothing. The screams carried across the water toward the shore, where villagers heard them and, well, they did nothing. The white ship's passengers had been screaming loudly enough all evening that the cries were mistaken for just more of the same. Of everyone aboard, the crew, the courtiers, 2 of the king's own children, William himself, only one person survived the night. His name was Beryl, a butcher from Rouen who had boarded to collect the debt he was owed and clung to a floating spar of the mast until morning. Every noble on board drowned. Beryl, a simple commoner, survived. Back in England, Henry waited for news of his son's arrival. The news, when it finally came, was that there would be no arrival. Not of William, not of most of the young Anglo-Norman nobility that had sailed on the white ship, not of Richard, nor of Matilda. Modern historians wrote that Henry never smiled again after hearing this. Whether or not that's literally true, the practical damage was undeniable. His only legitimate son and heir was dead, and his queen, Matilda of Scotland, had already been dead for 2 years. Following this, Henry remarried quickly to a young noblewoman named Adeliza of Louvain, hoping for another son, but none came. With his male line exhausted, Henry turned to the one child he had left, his daughter, Empress Matilda, which was a title she carried from her first marriage to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, whom she'd serve as consort and effectively co-ruler until his death in 1125. She was, by the standards of the time, unusually experienced in the actual business of governing. She was also, inconveniently for her 12th century sensibilities, a woman. Henry forced the issue anyways. In 1127 and again in 1131, he made his nobles swear formal oaths to accept Matilda as his successor. He also married her off a second time to Geoffrey of Anjou, politically useful since it secured Normandy's southern border, but deeply unpopular among the Anglo-Norman nobility, who regarded Anjou as an old rival and resented the match. But the nobles swore their oaths anyways. Oaths meant something in 1130, for a while anyways. In December 1135, Henry dies. Matilda was away in Anjou at the time. Stephen of Blois, the same cousin whose stomach trouble had saved his life 15 years earlier on the White Ship, was not. He crossed the Channel immediately, secured the support of London and much of the clergy, with a hell of a lot of help from his brother, Henry of Blois, who happened to be the Bishop of Winchester, and had himself crowned before Matilda could even respond to the news of her father's death. The oaths the nobles had sworn were quietly, collectively forgotten. Kind of convenient how that happens sometimes. What followed has gone down in English history simply as the Anarchy. And the name, not really an exaggeration. Fighting broke out in earnest around 1138, once Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's illegitimate half-brother and by far her most capable general, renounced his allegiance to Stephen and took up her cause. Matilda would eventually land in England in 1139 to press her claim in person, and for the next several years, the country descended into a war with almost no center. Sieges instead of battles, raids instead of campaigns. Castles built without royal license and held by whichever noble happened to control the surrounding land that season. Historians of the time described it starkly that in those years it seemed as though Christ and his saints had simply fallen asleep and left England to fend for itself. The war swung back and forth without ever really resolving. At the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, Stephen was captured. And for a brief window, Matilda controlled the kingdom outright, entering London and taking the title Lady of the English in preparation for a formal coronation. It didn't last. Her demands alienated the citizens of London badly enough that they rose against her before the coronation could happen. Her forces were routed at what became known as the Rout of Winchester, and Robert of Gloucester was captured in the retreat. Matilda had no choice but to trade her brother for Stephen, and the war reset to where it had started to begin with. The years that followed were less a conflict than a slow war of attrition. Matilda was besieged at Oxford Castle in the winter of 1142, and according to legend, escaped across the frozen Thames at night wearing white to blend into the snow. Robert of Gloucester's death in 1147 took the fight out of her cause more thoroughly than any battlefield loss had. And by 1148, she'd left England for good, handing the campaign to the one person left who could plausibly finish it, her son. Her son, the future Henry II, was a different kind of threat than his mother had been. By the time he mounted his own invasion of England in 1153, he was already Duke of Normandy in his own right, and through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, controlled a stretch of continental territory that dwarfed anything Stephen could match. He was young, capable, and backed by resources his mother never had. He didn't need to win outright. By 1153, most of England's barons, many of whom held land on both sides of the conflict and had spent nearly 2 decades watching their country come apart, wanted the fighting to just simply stop. Stephen's own heir, his son Eustace, died suddenly in August of that year, removing the one obstacle that might have kept the war going out of pure stubbornness on Stephen's side. The result was the Treaty of Wallingford, agreed that November. Stephen would keep the crown for the remainder of his life, and Henry would be formally recognized as his heir, bypassing Stephen's surviving younger son entirely. It was less a victory for either claimant than an exhausting compromise, but it held. Stephen died less than a year later in October of 1154, and Henry II succeeded him without a fight, founding the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for the next 250 years. He would spend most of his early reign simply cleaning up after the Civil War, tearing down the unlicensed castles that had sprung up across the countryside, rebuilding the courts and currency his grandfather had established, dragging royal authority back from the nobles who'd spent nearly 2 decades treating it as, well, up for grabs. Modern historians still argue over how uniformly brutal the anarchy actually was. Some regions, especially the contested borderlands, suffered badly, while others saw very little disruption to their daily lives. But once you strip all of that away, one thing is hard to miss. A single overloaded ship, a drunk crew, and a hole torn in the hull off the coast of Normandy in 1120 didn't just kill 200 people. It killed the plan. Everything Henry I had spent his reign building, the stability, the succession, the line of justices, careful legal order, sank with the White Ship in about 15 minutes. And England spent the next 35 years finding out exactly what happens to a kingdom when the water closes over its heir. And that was the White Ship disaster and the anarchy that followed. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please consider leaving a rating or review on your app of choice. And you can reach out to the show at historiesofdisaster@gmail.com with questions, comments, or suggestions. As well as following the show on social media like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, whatever. And share the episode. Your friends will love it. And just remember, the Emperor Penguin, not a real emperor. So if your dreams of dynasty involve kidnapping one and holding it for ransom, you might want to rethink your life choices. Anyways, chase that dream, unless it's of dynasty. Live for today, because tomorrow is never guaranteed. Thanks and goodbye.